Halloween night was my favorite time of year. I loved the decorations, the costumes, the excitement in the air. My front porch was decked out in Jack-O, lanterns and spooky lights, and I'd stocked up on enough candy to last the whole night. Kids came in waves, giggling and shouting trick or treat as I handed out treats to ghosts, vampires, and superheroes of every kind. It was around 8 when I noticed him for the first time, a small boy, maybe 7 or 8, dressed as a pirate. His costume was simple but effective, with a little eye patch, a striped shirt, and a plastic sword at his side. He was standing on the sidewalk just beyond the gate, not quite close enough to be waiting for candy, but just watching. I smiled at him, waving for him to come closer, but he turned and walked away down the street. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was shy or waiting for his friends. But about 15 minutes later, as the next group of kids came up, I saw him again, standing in the same spot, just watching. He held my gaze this time, his face half hidden in the shadow of his little pirate hat. Something about the way he looked at me made my skin prickle, like there was more to his stare than just curiosity. I thought about calling out to him, but more kids showed up, and I was busy handing out candy. By the time I looked back, the little pirate was gone. Another half hour went by, and I'd almost forgotten about him when he reappeared, standing just a few feet closer this time. The streetlights cast an eerie glow on his costume, and his eyes were fixed on me with an intensity that felt strange, especially for a child. I waited, expecting him to step forward with the other kids, but he didn't. He just stood there, silent, as if he was waiting for something. After another minute, he turned and walked down the street again, disappearing into the shadows. I felt a chill that I couldn't quite explain. Something about him just seemed off. As the night wore on, the groups of trick-or-treaters started thinning out, and I was about ready to pack up. But just as I was about to turn off the porch light, I saw him again, standing in the exact same spot, watching me. This time, I felt a surge of concern. He'd been walking alone all night, without any parents or friends around, and he hadn't come up to the door a single time. It struck me as odd. Why was he spending his Halloween night just watching people from a distance? I called out to him, my voice soft but steady. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need any help? Where are your parents?" But he didn't respond. He just looked at me, his face a blank mask under that little pirate hat, and then, slowly, he turned and walked away again, this time around the corner and out of sight. I felt an inexplicable urge to follow him, to make sure he was okay, but something in me held back. There was an unease that I couldn't shake, a sense that maybe I didn't really want to find out who he was. Feeling unsettled, I went back inside, but I couldn't let it go. I decided to ask around, see if any of the neighbors had noticed him too. I knocked on a few doors, asking if anyone had seen a little boy dressed as a pirate wandering alone. But no one had. Some hadn't even noticed him, and those who had simply assumed he was another trick-or-treater passing by. I was starting to feel like maybe I'd imagined him, or maybe he was just a neighborhood kid who'd slipped away before anyone noticed. But then I mentioned him to my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Harper. Her face paled when I described him, and she looked at me with something close to fear. "Are you sure you saw him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, feeling a chill at her reaction. "Yes, he was just standing there, watching. I thought maybe he was lost or looking for someone." Mrs. Harper shook her head slowly. "That sounds like Tommy," she said, her voice shaking. "He was a boy who lived around here years ago. Loved Halloween, always dressed as a pirate. But one Halloween night, he went out trick-or-treating alone and never came back. They searched for days, but he was gone, just vanished without a trace. Some people say he still comes back on Halloween, looking for home." I felt the blood drain from my face. I wanted to argue, to laugh it off as an old ghost story, but Mrs. Harper's expression was deadly serious. Her eyes had a haunted look, like she was seeing something from her past. I thanked her quickly, excusing myself and heading back to my house, feeling that same prickling chill as I locked the door. I spent the rest of the night glancing out the window, half expecting to see that little pirate standing at the edge of my yard, watching. But he didn't appear again. The street remained empty, silent, as if Halloween had ended and taken all its strange energy with it. Every Halloween since, I still look for him. half hoping he won't be there and half expecting to see that small figure in the pirate hat, standing just beyond the porch light. I never saw him again, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, wandering the neighborhood, searching for something or someone to guide him home. It was late, well past midnight, when I finally boarded the last train home. Halloween night had been great. A costume party with friends, a few drinks, and enough scares to make the evening memorable. The quiet of the station was a stark contrast to the laughter and noise of the party. I felt a chill as I stepped onto the empty platform, my footsteps echoing in the silence as I made my way toward the single open car. I settled into a seat near the door, eager for the short ride home, hoping to relax and enjoy a few minutes of peace before crashing into bed. As I glanced around, I realized I wasn't alone. Down at the other end of the car, slouched in the farthest seat, sat a lone figure. They wore a dark, oversized hoodie, the hood pulled up to obscure most of their face, casting deep shadows. I couldn't make out their features, only the outline of a head and shoulders. A strange unease settled over me. It wasn't uncommon to see odd people on the last train of the night, but something about this person felt different. I kept telling myself it was nothing, probably just someone exhausted from their own Halloween night. Still, I couldn't shake the prickling feeling on the back of my neck, that sense of being watched, even though the figure hadn't moved. I turned away, focusing on my phone, hoping to distract myself. But after a few minutes, curiosity, or maybe just nerves, got the best of me, and I glanced over at the stranger again. The figure had shifted ever so slightly, leaning forward just enough that the hood now pointed in my direction, as if they were watching me from behind the darkness. I stared, half expecting them to say something, maybe some late-night ramble, but there was only silence. The figure sat frozen, unmoving, but I could feel their gaze, like a weight pressing down on me, even though I couldn't see their eyes. My heart started to race. I told myself I was just tired, maybe letting the Halloween spirit get to my head. I looked away again, gripping my phone, the dim light from the screen casting a faint glow that felt oddly comforting. I tried to convince myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just some random person minding their own business. But that eerie feeling wouldn't go away. The train rocked gently as it sped through the tunnels, the lights flickering every now and then. Each time they blinked off, I felt a jolt of fear, imagining the figure inching closer in the dark. I knew it was irrational, but the silence in the car was deafening, almost oppressive. After a few minutes, I couldn't help myself. I glanced up again, and this time, the figure was leaned even closer, as if inching forward with each flicker of darkness. The hood was still pulled low, hiding their face, but I could just make out the faintest glint where their eyes should have been, like two dark pits watching me from beneath the shadows. I held my breath, feeling my pulse thudding in my ears. Every instinct screamed for me to look away, to ignore it, but my eyes were locked on the figure, frozen in a silent staring contest. The train began to slow, the automated voice announcing the next station, and relief washed over me. I didn't care that it wasn't my stop, I just needed to get off. As soon as the doors opened, I bolted up, barely glancing back as I hurried out of the car, feeling an odd mix of embarrassment and terror. I told myself it was nothing, just some stranger messing with me, maybe sensing my nervousness and enjoying it. But as I stepped onto the platform, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a prank. The doors started to slide shut, and out of morbid curiosity, or maybe just a need for closure, I looked back through the window, hoping to see the figure had relaxed, that it was all in my head. But no, the figure had moved even closer, now pressed up against the glass, face nearly touching it. I could still only see shadows, no real features, but I felt its gaze, dark and intense, burning through the glass, fixated on me. I took a step back, a chill spreading through me as the train began to pull away. The figure didn't move, didn't break eye contact. They stayed there, watching me, until the train disappeared into the tunnel, leaving me alone on the platform, the silence feeling heavier than ever. I stood there for a moment, unable to move, The memory of that shadowed face seared into my mind. The walk home felt longer than usual, each shadow and distant sound making me jump, half expecting to see that hooded figure waiting around the next corner. Even when I finally made it back to my apartment, locking the door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't left a stranger behind on that train. It's been weeks, and yet every time I take the train alone at night, I catch myself glancing toward the back of the car, half expecting to see that dark figure, but pulled low, waiting in the shadows. If you're enjoying the stories so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us. We'd love to hear it. Now let's dive into the next story. It was close to midnight on Halloween, and I was pedaling home from a friend's house, my backpack filled with leftover candy. The night was quiet. Most of the trick-or-treaters had already gone home, and the streets were only dotted here and there with jack-o'-lanterns casting eerie glows from front porches. I'd taken my bike to my friend's place since I didn't live far and didn't want to be out too late. The night air was cool, and the whole town seemed to be under a blanket of fog and darkness. As I rode along, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was just out of sight, watching me. I was about 10 minutes from home when I noticed headlights appear behind me, moving slowly. At first, I didn't think anything of it. It was Halloween, and people were still out celebrating. But after a few blocks, I realized the car wasn't just cruising around. It was following me. Every time I turned, the car would make the same turn. I glanced back a few times, trying to get a look, but the headlights were too bright, and the car was just far enough behind that I couldn't make out the driver. All I could see was that it was a dark sedan, moving at an unnaturally slow pace. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just someone taking the same route home. But when I sped up, the car sped up too, keeping the same distance. The slow, deliberate way it followed me was unnerving. It was like the driver was matching my pace on purpose, hanging back just enough to keep me in their sights. My heart began to pound a little harder. The streets were nearly empty now, and I couldn't see any houses with lights still on. I took a sharp left onto a side street, hoping to lose them, but when I looked back, the car was still there, rounding the corner smoothly. The realization hit me. Whoever was in that car wasn't just accidentally taking the same route. They were following me. Trying not to panic, I kept my pace steady, breathing hard, hoping I could outrun them. I was coming up on a little park and figured maybe I could cut through it and lose them in the maze of paths and trees. I swerved off the street onto the park trail, speeding up as I pedaled over the bumpy grass. For a few minutes, I felt relief, thinking I'd shaken them. The trail wound around trees and ducked through a few small hills, giving me just enough cover. But as I reached the other side of the park, I heard the low hum of an engine again. My stomach dropped. I glanced around and saw it. The car, somehow waiting at the edge of the park, headlights off, like it had anticipated my move. It was parked there, blocking my exit, as if daring me to try and pass. Panic surged through me. I turned my bike back toward the main street, hoping to find another way out of the park, but the only other exit was a long way around, and I knew the car could easily cut me off again if it wanted. So I did the only thing I could think of. I doubled back, sprinting through the trail I'd just taken, hoping to throw the driver off. My mind raced with possibilities, wondering why someone would be following me like this, and why they seemed so intent on cornering me. As I emerged from the park and got back onto a side street, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror attached to my bike, watching for the car. For a few minutes, I didn't see it, and my heart rate started to slow down. Maybe I'd lost him this time, but as I pedaled toward my neighborhood, I felt that creeping sensation again. I looked up, and there it was, just ahead, parked on the side of the road, its headlights still off. The car seemed almost like it was waiting for me, perfectly still, with no sign of movement from inside. I stopped my bike, torn between pedaling back the way I came or making a run for it. My house was only a few blocks away, and I knew if I could just make it there, I'd be safe. I took a deep breath, gripping the handlebars, and then shot forward, pedaling as fast as I could. The car didn't move at first, but as soon as I passed it, I heard the engine rumble to life. The car pulled out behind me, creeping along, the headlights flicking on and casting an eerie glow across the street. My heart pounded as I raced toward home, the car still following me at that slow, deliberate pace. I turned into my street and, just before pulling into my driveway, glanced back one last time. The car had stopped at the corner, headlights off again, its shadowy figure barely visible in the dark. I dashed inside, locking the door behind me and peeking through the curtains, hoping to see the car drive away. But when I looked outside, it was gone. The street was empty, the quiet of the night settling back in as if nothing had happened. I barely slept that night, haunted by the sight of that car's headlights appearing out of nowhere. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened, but they chalked it up to Halloween antics, a harmless scare that had gone a bit too far. But I knew it wasn't just a prank. Whoever was in that car had followed me with purpose, had known exactly where I was going, and seemed to have no intention of stopping until I'd gotten home. For weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the memory of that slow, shadowy car trailing me through the streets, seeming to appear just when I thought I'd escaped. Every time I went out alone, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the streets for any sign of it. And every Halloween since, I can't help but feel that familiar prickling sensation, as if somewhere in the dark, that car is still watching, waiting for the right moment to follow me home again. It was around 1 a.m., and I was making my way home after a Halloween party. The streets were deserted, the air was cool, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my shoes. I lived close enough to walk home, so my parents had agreed to let me stay out late, as long as I didn't wander. It was that strange hour of the night when everything feels empty, like the world is holding its breath, and there's a quietness that settles in, making even the familiar feel eerie. As I walked down the main road, I passed by the bus stop just a few blocks from my house. I'd walked this route countless times, but tonight it felt different. A man was sitting there, slouched on the bench, his face hidden by the hood of his dark coat. He looked almost statuesque, completely still, as if he were frozen in time. The streetlight cast shadows that made his figure even more unsettling. I tried to shrug it off, probably someone just waiting for the last bus, I told myself, or maybe a costume that blended too well with the dark. But the feeling wouldn't shake. I kept walking, focusing on the pavement in front of me, eager to get past the strange figure. I was almost a block away when I heard it, a voice calling my name. "Hey, Alex." It wasn't loud, but it cut through the stillness like a knife. My stomach twisted. I froze, every instinct telling me not to turn around. It was the same voice you'd expect to hear from an old friend, someone who knew you well, with a tone that almost felt familiar, but I didn't recognize it. I couldn't place it. Slowly, I turned to look back at the bus stop. The man was gone. The bench was empty, the street silent and completely deserted. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of him, but there was nothing, no footsteps, no rustling leaves, no shadow darting into the darkness. Just the empty bench and the eerie glow of the streetlight casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I stood there, rooted to the spot, trying to make sense of what had happened. I thought maybe he'd walked away, maybe he was hiding somewhere, just out of sight, but the silence around me was absolute. I took a few hesitant steps toward the bus stop, straining my ears for any sound, but there was nothing, no footsteps, no movement, just the quiet hum of the streetlight above. My heart pounded as I replayed the moment in my head. How did he know my name? I was sure I'd never seen him before. He wasn't at the party, and as far as I knew, he wasn't from my neighborhood. I stood there for a few seconds longer, half hoping he'd appear again, half dreading that he actually would. Realizing I was alone, I turned and hurried home, my mind racing. Every shadow seemed darker. Every gust of wind felt heavier, like it carried something unseen with it. I walked faster, practically jogging by the time I turned onto my street, not daring to look back again. When I finally reached my front door, I fumbled with the key, hands shaking, heart racing. I got inside, locked the door, and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. That night, I lay in bed, wide awake, replaying it all in my mind. The dark figure, the voice, the empty bench. It didn't make sense. How did he know my name? Why had he disappeared so suddenly? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something I wasn't seeing. But there was no answer, just the memory of that strange, low voice and the unsettling feeling that I'd been watched by something that knew me far too well. The days went by, but the memory of that night didn't fade. I walked by the bus stop again during the day, hoping to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, just a stranger who happened to disappear as I turned around. But the moment was too vivid to forget, and every time I passed that bench, I felt a shiver run down my spine, like something was lingering there, waiting, just out of sight. Even now, I sometimes catch myself glancing over my shoulder when I walk home alone at night, half expecting to see a figure sitting on that bench, hooded, head bowed, waiting for the perfect moment to call my name again. Halloween was always my favorite time of year. The costumes, the chill in the air, the glow of Jacko, lanterns lining the streets. This year, I decided to stay home, hand out candy, and enjoy the night from my cozy living room. The trick-or-treaters had been adorable, a parade of superheroes and witches, and by the time the night started winding down around 10, I figured the last round of candy seekers had come and gone. Just to be sure, I decided to check if there were any stragglers. I flipped on the porch light, grabbed the bowl of candy, and went to the front door. As I stood there for a moment, looking out at the quiet street, something in the stillness felt off. There were no more trick-or-treaters, just an eerie silence. I stepped back inside, closed the door, and was about to lock it when I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. Down the hallway, I saw that the back door, the one I was sure I had locked earlier, was slightly open. The darkness outside was thick, and the back porch light was off, casting the open door in deep shadows. My stomach dropped. I knew I'd check that door before I started handing out candy. I was meticulous about locking up, especially when I was home alone. But now, there it was cracked open, as if someone had slipped in while I was distracted by the front door. My mind raced. I hadn't heard anything, no footsteps, no creaks, just a heavy silence. I swallowed, every hair on my body standing on end as I tried to steady my breathing. Was it possible that someone had been in the house the whole time? Maybe watching me from the shadows as I handed out candy? Without making a sound, I stepped backward, forcing myself to stay calm, and slowly shut the front door. I could feel my pulse racing as I locked it, one hand trembling against the handle. Then, moving as quietly as I could, I went around the house, checking the windows and making sure every other door was locked. When I reached the back door again, I hesitated, staring at it. The darkness beyond the doorway seemed to stretch out endlessly, as if something could be hiding just out of sight, waiting. I took a deep breath, reached out, and closed the door, locking it with a trembling hand. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, to get as far away as possible, but I knew I needed to make sure the house was secure. I checked each room, glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow or hear footsteps following me. But the house was silent, eerily so, like it was holding its breath along with me. Once everything was locked, I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. My voice shook as I explained that I thought someone might have broken in. They assured me they'd send someone over to check things out, and I sat on the couch, clutching my phone, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. It felt like ages before the officers arrived, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they checked each room, looking in closets, behind furniture, and even under the bed. They combed through the house, their footsteps echoing through the halls, but found nothing out of place, just the door still firmly locked, as if it had never been opened. When they finished, one of the officers, a tall, no-nonsense woman with a calm voice, came over to me. "There's no sign of forced entry," she said gently. "It could be that the door didn't latch properly earlier, or maybe it was a draft that opened it." I nodded, trying to absorb her words, but something didn't sit right with me. I knew I'd locked that door. They offered to have a patrol car check the area throughout the night, which gave me some comfort. But once they left, I was alone again, the silence settling back in, heavier than before. I checked the locks again, every one of them, trying to convince myself that the officers were right, that I had just forgotten to latch the door properly. But as I lay in bed, Every sound seemed amplified: the creaks of the house, the soft rustling of leaves outside. Even the occasional hum of the refrigerator felt louder, more menacing. I kept replaying the night in my mind, trying to remember every detail. The front door had been locked. The back door had been locked. I was sure of it. The thought gnawed at me, making sleep impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that dark, open doorway, like it was calling out to me, like something unseen had slipped inside and was now lurking somewhere, hidden, waiting. Halloween came and went, but I never quite got over that night. I checked my locks obsessively after that, always double and triple checking, but the unease lingered. And on nights when the wind is quiet and the house is dark, I still find myself staring down that hallway, half expecting to see the back door creak open, as if it remembers that one Halloween night and is waiting for the right moment to invite something in once more. It was close to 1 a.m., and Halloween night was winding down. The streets were empty as I made my way home after a party, still in costume, a quick last-minute outfit I'd thrown together. I wasn't tired yet, so I figured I'd stop by the convenience store near my place for a snack before calling it a night. As I walked up, I noticed a man standing just outside the store, lingering near the entrance. He was tall, with a thin build, wearing a dark coat that looked heavy for the cool autumn night. He didn't seem to be doing anything, just standing there with his back mostly turned to me, his head lowered as if studying the door. I brushed it off. Maybe he was waiting for someone or just taking a breather. I went inside, the bright lights of the store almost jarring after the darkness of the street. I quickly grabbed a drink and a bag of chips, trying to ignore the slight discomfort gnawing at me as I paid. When I left the store, the man was still there, but this time he was turned toward the door, staring directly at me as I stepped outside. There was something strange in his gaze, an intensity that made my skin prickle. His eyes followed me as I walked by, but he didn't say a word, didn't move. He just watched me, his face unreadable, almost blank. My mind raced, and I forced myself to act casual, heading down the street as if nothing was wrong. But as I rounded the corner, I couldn't resist looking back, hoping he'd gone back to minding his own business. He was following me. The man kept his distance, but there was no mistaking it. His pace matched mine, his footsteps soft but deliberate. I felt a chill creep up my spine. It was late, the streets empty, and every instinct screamed for me to run. But I didn't want to panic. Maybe he just happened to be going in the same direction. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was all in my head. But each time I glanced over my shoulder, he was still there, trailing behind at a steady, unnerving pace. I quickened my steps, hoping to put some distance between us. My apartment was just a few blocks away, and I figured if I could reach a busier street, I'd feel safer. But when I picked up the pace, so did he. I could hear his footsteps growing louder, echoing off the buildings around us. Each step deliberate, measured. My heart pounded as I turned down a side street, taking a shortcut through a quieter part of the neighborhood. I could feel his gaze, even without looking back, that unsettling presence just a few paces behind. I kept walking, refusing to run, hoping he'd give up and turn back. But as I rounded the next corner, I couldn't resist. I glanced back, expecting to see him right behind me. He was gone. The street was empty, silent, as if he'd never been there. My pulse was still racing, my nerves on edge, and I scanned the shadows, half expecting him to step out from a hidden corner or reappear at the end of the block. But there was nothing, no footsteps, no movement, just the eerie quiet of an empty street. I waited for a moment, trying to catch my breath, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the memory of his gaze, those unblinking eyes following my every step, lingered, refusing to fade. I kept walking, my pace quicker now, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, but the street remained empty. When I finally reached my building, I practically sprinted up the stairs, fumbling with my keys as I unlocked the door. I stepped inside, locking it behind me, breathing a sigh of relief. But even in the safety of my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, watching and waiting. It's been weeks, And I still can't forget that man, his unsettling gaze, the way he'd followed me through the quiet streets. I never saw him again, and maybe it was all just some strange coincidence. But every time I walk home late at night, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure, following me just out of sight. It was Halloween evening, and I'd made a quick stop at the grocery store to pick up a few last-minute things. The store was unusually quiet, most people probably busy with parties or trick-or-treating. The aisles felt empty, and I thought I'd be in and out in a few minutes. I grabbed the basket, mentally ticking off the things I needed: milk, some snacks, and maybe a few bags of leftover Halloween candy on sale. As I turned down the snack aisle, I noticed him for the first time, a man standing at the end of the aisle, wearing a dark coat and a blank expression. He looked out of place, not really doing much of anything, just staring at the shelves with a vague disinterest. I barely registered him at first, just a stranger minding his business, and went back to scanning the shelves. But then, a few minutes later, as I moved to a different section of the store, there he was again. Same aisle, just a few feet behind me, staring at a display like he was genuinely interested in bags of flour. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just a coincidence. He could have been taking the same path as me. But every time I turned around, he was nearby, standing a few steps behind or lingering just at the edge of the aisle. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me. Each time I glanced back, he'd act like he was studying a product, his expression shifting to feigned interest in whatever was closest. I'd move to another section, only to find him again, shadowing me, his gaze never meeting mine, but his presence impossible to ignore. At one point, I pretended to look at my phone, hoping he'd pass by or go a different way. But when I glanced up, he was still there, watching me from the corner of his eye. The store was silent, the usual background noise almost muted, making his presence feel all the more unsettling. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I tried to shake off my discomfort, telling myself I was probably just imagining it. It was Halloween, after all, maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. But as I moved toward the back of the store, the unease only grew. I tried to test it, weaving in and out of aisles, taking random turns, hoping to lose him. But he matched every move, always a few steps behind, his expression blank, like he was waiting for something. At one point, I stopped abruptly, pretending to read the label on a cereal box, just to see if he'd do the same. He did. He stopped a few feet away, pretending to look at a display of canned goods, his eyes shifting subtly in my direction. My heart started pounding, and I decided I'd had enough. I didn't want to confront him, but I wasn't going to stick around any longer either. I headed straight for the checkout, feeling his gaze on me the whole way, every nerve in my body screaming for me to get out of there. When I reached the front of the store and turned to look, he was gone. Just like that, he'd vanished, as if he'd melted into the shadows of the aisles. I took a breath, feeling a rush of relief as I paid for my groceries. Maybe he'd left, or maybe he'd finally gotten bored of following me. But I couldn't shake the unease that lingered, the feeling that he'd been watching me, tracking my every move through the quiet store. I hurried out of the store, clutching my bags tightly, and made a beeline for my car. The parking lot was dark, with only a few dim streetlights casting long shadows across the empty spaces. I scanned the lot, half expecting to see him lurking somewhere nearby, but there was no sign of him. I started to relax, fumbling for my keys as I approached my car. But just as I was about to unlock the door, I caught sight of something in the distance. There he was, standing at the far end of the parking lot, his face still hidden in shadow, his gaze fixed directly on me. He wasn't moving, just watching, his figure motionless against the backdrop of the empty lot. My heart raced as I quickly unlocked the door, throwing my bags into the passenger seat and jumping in. I locked the doors and glanced up, half expecting him to be walking toward me, but he was still just standing there, staring. It felt like he was daring me to make the next move, waiting to see if I'd react. I didn't wait to find out what he was planning. I started the engine and sped out of the parking lot, glancing in the rearview mirror as I pulled away. The man didn't move, didn't follow. He just stood there, watching as I drove off, his dark figure growing smaller and smaller until he finally disappeared into the shadows. That night, I couldn't shake the image of him standing there, his gaze locked onto me, like he knew exactly where I was going. I double-checked my locks before bed, telling myself it was probably just some strange coincidence, a harmless creep with nothing better to do. But even now, every time I step into a grocery store or wander down an empty aisle, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure in the dark coat, watching me from afar, waiting for me to notice him again. It was close to 2 a.m., and the Halloween party had finally wrapped up. I was heading back to my car in a parking lot that was nearly empty, save for a few scattered cars under the flickering streetlights. The quiet was unsettling, the kind that hangs heavy, with just enough darkness to make you glance over your shoulder. My car was parked toward the back, and the only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the night breeze. As I got closer, I noticed her, a woman standing right next to my car. She was alone, her face partially hidden by a curtain of dark hair, her shoulders hunched as she leaned slightly against my car, almost as if she'd been waiting for someone. Her clothes weren't exactly a costume, but had this odd, old-fashioned look, like she'd stepped out of another time. For a moment, I wondered if she'd been at the party, but I didn't recognize her. I stopped a few paces away, trying not to startle her, but she didn't acknowledge me at all. She just stared straight ahead, lost in thought, or at least pretending to be. It was a strange feeling, like she was there for a reason, yet completely ignoring my presence. My heart pounded as I approached, each step hesitant. I felt trapped between wanting to ask her if she needed help and the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. "Excuse me, do you need something?" I finally asked, trying to keep my voice steady. At that, she lifted her head slightly, her face still partially hidden in shadow. She didn't respond, didn't even look directly at me. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder and slowly began walking in the opposite direction, away from my car. Her movements were slow and deliberate, almost like she was daring me to follow her. I watched as she walked across the lot, my stomach churning with a sense of dread. And then, almost out of nowhere, a car's headlights flicked on a few rows down, illuminating her for a brief second as she approached it. It was an old, nondescript sedan, one I hadn't noticed earlier, though it was parked in the open. She got in without looking back, the door closing with an eerie quietness, and the car just sat there, idling, the headlights casting an eerie glow across the empty lot. The whole scene felt like a surreal nightmare. I kept waiting for her to drive away, for this strange encounter to be over, but the car didn't move. The headlights stayed on, pointed directly at me, and I felt the weight of eyes on me, though I couldn't see her through the glare. With a chill creeping up my spine, I got into my own car, locking the doors instinctively. I turned on the engine and tried to steady my breathing, glancing over my shoulder to see if she'd finally left. But the car was still there, headlights trained on me, casting long, twisted shadows across the asphalt. For a moment, I debated getting out, confronting her, demanding to know what she wanted, but something told me to just leave. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I watched the headlights in my mirror, half expecting her to follow me. But she didn't move. The car stayed parked, her silhouette barely visible through the window. I drove off, each turn bringing a bit of relief, telling myself it was over, that I'd just had a strange, unsettling encounter with someone who probably didn't even realize how creepy she'd been. But as I got closer to home, the feeling that I was being watched intensified. Every shadow along the road seemed darker. Every car that passed felt like it was watching me. I couldn't shake the sensation, and as I pulled into my driveway, a chill ran through me. I parked and turned off the engine, sitting in the silence, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Yet, as I got out of the car, I couldn't help glancing down the street, half expecting to see that old sedan with its headlights on, waiting just out of sight. The street was empty, but the silence felt heavier, more menacing, as if someone or something was hiding just beyond the glow of the streetlights. Once inside, I locked the door, double-checking each window, each bolt. The house was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting a faint glow through the curtains. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I peeked out the window, scanning the street again, but it was empty. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a Halloween prank or maybe just a harmless stranger. But that night, as I lay in bed, every creak, every whisper of wind against the house made my heart race. I kept expecting to hear footsteps outside or see headlights cutting through the darkness outside my window. It's been weeks, and I've yet to shake the memory of that woman in the parking lot. Every time I walk through a dark lot or see a lone car parked in the shadows, I feel her gaze, that silent, unnerving presence. I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see that old sedan lurking somewhere nearby, headlights off, with a dark silhouette behind the wheel, just waiting. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss our next video. Check out 10 creepy true Halloween night horror stories to make your skin crawl by clicking the card on the screen or finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.